For 10 full seconds, New York City stopped making noise. Not slowed, not paused, stopped. On the Brooklyn Bridge, a jogger mid-stride forgot to land his foot. A rideshare driver eased off the gas without knowing why. A tourist raised a phone, then lowered it, suddenly unsure what could be captured. The East River, usually restless beneath steel and traffic, lay unnaturally smooth, as if holding a breath it had never learned to take. A firefighter leaned on the railing, sensing the quiet before he understood it. A finance analyst still wearing his office badge felt the vibration of the bridge fade beneath his shoes. A mother pushing a stroller felt her child grow still. Small hands no longer fidgeting. None of them spoke. None of them signaled to one another. Yet all of them looked up. Above the cables. Above the traffic lanes. Above the city that never stops announcing itself. The sky behaved as if it had received a command. Wind dropped away. Clouds thickened and slowed. No longer drifting but gathering. The constant background roar of America's loudest city sirens. Engines. Voices. Construction fell into a hush so complete it felt physical. Pressing gently against the chest. A helicopter circled overhead, its blades suddenly sounding too loud. Then pulling back, as if unwilling to intrude. A construction worker from Queens glanced around. Confused. Meeting the eyes of a stranger in a business suit. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. They shared the same unasked question. Why does this feel like a moment you're not supposed to interrupt? Phones hovered in the air. Forgotten. A cyclist stepped off his bike. Somewhere near the center of the bridge. A group of pedestrians stopped moving altogether. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. The city that prides itself on momentum, efficiency, and certainty was experiencing something it had no framework for. Silence. Not the empty silence of abandonment, but the charged stillness that comes before something irreversible. Like the pause before a verdict. Like the space between a heartbeat and the next breath. And in that silence before anyone could name it, explain it, or argue about it, New York understood one thing with unsettling clarity. Whatever was about to happen did not need permission. The first person to react did not shout. She didn't pray. She simply froze. Near the center of the bridge, a teenage girl filming the skyline lowered her phone halfway, eyes narrowing as if her vision had slipped out of focus. The clouds ahead were no longer behaving like clouds. They weren't thinning or breaking apart. They were shaping themselves. Above the web of steel cables, light began to pool, not bright, not blinding, but soft and deliberate, like a lamp turned on behind frosted glass. A silhouette emerged slowly, not arriving from anywhere, but revealing itself as if it had been there all along. The form was human, unmistakably so, yet made of mist and glow rather than flesh. Robes seemed to flow without wind. Arms opened, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to suggest welcome. No one announced what they were seeing. A delivery rider stopped his bike and squinted upward. Joe Slack, a Wall Street attorney, blinked hard, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. A pair of tourists whispered to each other in disbelief, switching languages mid-sentence as if one might explain what the other could not. Somewhere behind them, a skeptic who had come only to record a strange day on the bridge muttered, "That's not possible," even as his hands continued to film. There was no voice from the sky. No thunder. No command. The figure did not glow brighter to demand attention. It did not move closer. It simply remained. A nurse from Brooklyn felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in recognition she couldn't explain. A retired Marine shifted his weight uneasily. Trained instincts searching for threat and finding none. A priest standing among the crowd forgot the prayer forming in his mind and stared upward like everyone else. Suddenly stripped of language. What unsettled people most was not the image itself, but its restraint. No spectacle, no announcement, no explanation. The figure did not identify herself. No name echoed across the bridge. No meaning was offered. And yet, as more eyes lifted and more mouths fell silent, a strange consensus spread through the crowd, not spoken, not agreed upon, but felt. This was not something asking to be interpreted. It was something asking to be witnessed. A man known for arguing online about optics and mass hallucination found his certainty evaporating. "If this is a trick," he whispered to no one, "it's the most patient one I've ever seen." A woman who hadn't stepped inside a church in decades felt tears form without memory or reason. She did not kneel. She did not cross herself. She simply stood there, unable to look away. The figure in the sky offered no proof, no argument, no demand for belief. It stood above the bridge, suspended between Manhattan and Brooklyn, between doubt and devotion, between explanation and mystery present, unmistakable, and entirely uninterested in convincing anyone of anything. And somehow, that made it impossible to ignore. The first confirmations did not come from prayer, but from disbelief. A boy near the front of the pedestrian lane tugged on his father's jacket. Eyes wide, voice steady in a way only children manage. "Dad," he said, pointing upward, "why is that lady standing in the clouds?" His father, an electrician who hadn't been inside a church since his own childhood, followed the gesture. Then went very still. He didn't answer. He couldn't. A few yards away, two college students who had been live streaming the skyline for their followers stopped narrating mid-sentence. One lowered the phone. The other kept filming out of habit, whispering, "Do you see that too?" They weren't Catholic. They weren't religious at all. Their captions later wouldn't mention faith, only the phrase, "I don't know how to explain this." A city bus driver stuck in traffic on the lower roadway leaned forward against his windshield. Squinting, years of navigating chaos had taught him to read patterns: movement, weather, human behavior. This didn't fit any of them. "That's not fog," he muttered, shaking his head. "Fog doesn't stand still." Children noticed before adults because they didn't try to translate what they saw. A little girl perched on her mother's shoulder smiled and waved, unprompted, as if greeting someone familiar. Her mother, a marketing executive who described herself as spiritual but not religious, laughed nervously at first, then stopped when she realized her daughter wasn't joking. "She's pretty," the girl added softly. "She looks kind." Nearby, a man known among his friends for mocking miracle stories felt something unsettling. He wasn't searching for explanations. He wasn't even reaching for sarcasm. He was simply staring, mouth slightly open, heart racing for reasons he would later struggle to articulate. "Everyone keeps saying, 'clouds,'" he said to no one in particular. "But clouds don't have posture." The ripple spread outward. People who had no vocabulary for reverence found themselves quiet. People who distrusted religion felt no pressure to believe anything at all. There were no hymns, no instructions, no leaders telling the crowd what they were witnessing. And yet, the recognition passed between strangers through exchanged glances and raised eyebrows. "You see it too." What stood out most was not who reacted but who didn't. No clergy stepped forward. No one claimed authority. No voice declared meaning. The moment belonged entirely to ordinary people, commuters, skeptics, children, workers who had no incentive to imagine the same impossible thing at the same time. And as more of them looked up, a subtle shift occurred. The question was no longer "what is that?" It had quietly become something else entirely. "Why does it feel like she's been waiting for us to notice?" What happened next was not announced. It spread. At first, it was subtle small interruptions in America's favorite habits. A trader on a conference call stopped mid-sentence, staring out a glass-walled office overlooking the river. On the bridge, cyclists dismounted without being asked. Runners slowed, then walked, then stood still. No one honked. No one shouted. The rules of the city simply loosened. Traffic on the lower deck crawled, then stalled. A rideshare driver rested both hands on the wheel, engine idling, eyes lifted through the windshield. Behind him, another driver did the same. There was no chain reaction of anger, no blaring horns, no shouted insults. New York's famous impatience, its edge was absent, as if someone had turned down a setting no one knew existed. A police officer raised his radio, then lowered it again. There was nothing to report. No emergency, no threat, just a crowd behaving in a way crowds never do here, calm, unified, attentive to something that wasn't them. On sidewalks near the bridge entrances, pedestrians stopped walking in opposite directions and forgot to be annoyed by one another. A woman in heels leaned against a lamppost, shoes discarded beside her. A construction foreman removed his hard hat and held it against his chest without realizing why. An elderly man, usually hunched and hurried, stood upright, eyes lifted, breathing slow and even. Across the river, office buildings reflected the strange light above the bridge. And behind those windows, people rose from their desks. Meetings were abandoned. Emails went unanswered. Somewhere in Midtown, a newsroom producer watched a live traffic feed and frowned. "Why isn't anything moving?" she asked. No one had an answer. What made it extraordinary wasn't the stillness itself, it was the lack of resistance. America does not stop easily. It argues. It debates. It demands reasons. It pushes forward even when unsure. But on that afternoon, none of those instincts took over. The city that prides itself on momentum accepted the pause without protest. A veteran who had marched in protests and parades felt the difference immediately. This wasn't unity driven by anger or ideology. There were no chants, no signs, no cause to rally around. There was only attention shared. Wordless, collective. Parents noticed it in their children first. No tugging, no whining, no questions, just quiet watching. Teachers later said the same thing happened in classrooms miles away, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. For a brief, unrepeatable window of time, the machinery of American life, its noise, urgency, and friction stood down. Not because it was forced to, but because it chose to. And hanging over the Brooklyn Bridge, in that rare and fragile stillness, was the sense that whatever had drawn the city into silence was not impressed by power, speed, or certainty, only by attention. 12 hours earlier, nothing felt destined. The city was still loud than honking taxis before dawn. Delivery trucks double parked. The low mechanical sigh of subway doors opening and closing. New York moved the way it always does, forward. Fast, unconcerned with meaning. If anyone had suggested the day would end in silence, they would have been laughed off the platform. In a small apartment in Queens, a night shift nurse peeled off her scrubs and checked her phone. Missed calls from her mother. A voicemail left unheard. She sighed, promising herself she'd listen later. Then collapsed into sleep with the TV murmuring about weather patterns and market futures. Nothing in the forecast hinted at interruption. Across the river, a software engineer stayed up too late tweaking code for a Monday release. He hadn't thought about church in years, not since college. Not since faith became something other people argued about online. He bookmarked an article titled, "Why We Believe What We Believe," and never opened it. At 2:11 a.m., he finally shut his laptop, unaware that the question would return louder by daylight. In a Bronx parish hall, volunteers finished stacking chairs after a late rehearsal for a modest religious celebration planned for the weekend. Attendance was expected to be small. "People are busy," someone said with a shrug. The priest nodded, used to empty pews and polite indifference. He locked the door, said a quiet prayer no one heard, and went home. Elsewhere, a group of teenagers laughed their way through a bodega run, arguing about music, not miracles. A rideshare driver fueled up before his morning shift, scrolling headlines about conflict, division, and everything that felt permanently unresolved. "Same story, different day," he muttered. Even the sky gave no warning. The night passed clean and ordinary. No strange lights, no tremors, no whispered signs, just darkness giving way to morning, as it had millions of times before. By sunrise, the city was already sprinting again. Coffee cups steamed on street corners. Trains rattled underground. Schedules tightened their grip on people's attention. Plans were made, cancelled, revised. Lives unfolded in parallel, unaware they were drifting toward the same moment. If there was a common thread 12 hours earlier, it wasn't expectation. It was distraction. Everyone was looking down at phones, at tasks, at worries close enough to touch. No one was looking up. No one was listening for anything beyond the familiar noise. And yet, scattered across apartments, sidewalks, and quiet rooms, something fragile and unspoken was already in motion, not as a sign, not as a warning, but as a convergence. By the time the city would finally stop, later that day, many would swear there had been a feeling beforehand. A restlessness, a pause in the chest, a sense of something unfinished. But 12 hours before it happened, America had no idea it was about to remember how to be still. The procession was supposed to be small. It had been planned quietly, almost cautiously, knowing how easily public faith could be ignored or misunderstood. A few parish volunteers, a modest route, no grand expectations. In another time, it might have passed through the city like a whisper noticed only by those already listening. That morning, as preparations began, there was already doubt. A volunteer checked the time and frowned. "We might be late," she said, adjusting a simple white banner. Another looked at the street, too busy, too loud, too indifferent. A police liaison skimmed the paperwork and nodded politely, the way people do when they expect nothing remarkable to happen. And then, the city began to behave differently. The route was never officially blocked, yet pedestrians slowed near it. Drivers rolled past with radios turned down. People who had no idea what was planned found themselves lingering, as if the street itself were asking them not to rush. When the small group finally stepped forward, no fanfare, no announcement, it felt almost anticlimactic. A priest walked at the center, carrying what he had carried many times before. His steps were steady, practiced, unremarkable. He did not look up. He did not need to. What surprised everyone was not how many joined. It was how many noticed. Office workers leaned out of windows. A street photographer lowered his camera, unsure why he didn't want to capture this moment the way he captured everything else. A delivery driver cut his engine and stepped out, hands on his hips, watching in silence. Some didn't know what the procession meant. Others misidentified it entirely. A few dismissed it as symbolic theater. But none of them looked away. The procession moved slowly, not because it was delayed, but because the space around it seemed to stretch. The noise of the city softened near it, then returned a block away, as if sound itself respected an invisible boundary. Later, people would argue online about whether the procession caused what happened above the bridge. But in that moment, no one made the connection. They only felt it. A sense that something ancient was passing through something modern. A quiet insistence that this was not a performance seeking attention, but a gesture made regardless of whether it was seen. Ironically, that was what made it impossible to ignore. A man who prided himself on rational explanations watched the procession disappear down the street and felt an unexpected irritation, not at religion, but at himself. "Why does that feel important?" he asked under his breath. The procession ended without applause. No speeches, no headlines, just a dispersal back into ordinary life. Volunteers packed up, assuming the day would go on as planned. The priest returned to the parish, unaware of how closely the city had been watching. The procession had passed through America the way it always had, quietly, humbly, without demand. But this time, the city did not look past it. It looked through it. And somewhere between dismissal and recognition, something had already taken hold. It began without a cue. No stage lights, no speakers warming up, no musician stepping forward to claim the moment. The city didn't hear it at first, it felt it. The way pressure changes before a storm. A woman waiting at a crosswalk paused mid-step, hand tightening around her bag. "Do you hear that?" she asked no one. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't cut through the noise so much as slip between it, threading itself into the spaces traffic usually filled. When the light turned green, she didn't move. On a rooftop nearby, a building superintendent leaned over the railing, scanning the street for a street performer. There were none. The melody had no direction, no left or right, no up or down. It seemed to exist everywhere at once, like a memory shared by people who had never met. A violinist who busked most afternoons along the riverbank froze with his bow midair. His instrument was silent, yet his fingers tingled as if they were playing along. "That's not possible," he whispered, listening closely, not for sound, but for structure. The harmony was precise, intentional, too complete to be accidental. In a cafe blocks away, conversations trailed off. Cups hovered inches above tables. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when they realized no one else was laughing. A barista reached instinctively for the volume knob, convinced the music had to be coming from the speakers. They were off. Phones came out, then were lowered again. People tried to record it. Later, they would discover the videos captured only silence and city noise. As if the music refused to be stored, replayed, or owned. It existed only in the moment and only for those present. A music theory professor on her lunch break felt tears well without warning. Not because the melody was sad, but because it resolved in places she hadn't known were unresolved. It's like it knows where to land, she said softly to a stranger beside her. The stranger nodded, unable to explain why he agreed. What unsettled many wasn't the beauty. It was the order. The music did not swell dramatically. It did not build toward spectacle. It remained steady, restrained, almost reverent, like something aware of its surroundings. Careful not to overwhelm, as if it were accompanying something already happening, rather than demanding attention for itself. Children reacted differently. They didn't analyze it. They swayed. One hummed along perfectly, despite never having heard the melody before. Her mother stared at her, then at the sky, then back again, a quiet fear giving way to awe. Some searched for speakers. Others checked nearby churches, concert halls, construction sites, anywhere sound might originate. There was nothing. No source, no echo, no explanation. And yet, as the music continued, something unmistakable occurred across the city. People stopped trying to explain it. They listened. For once, America did not argue with the moment. It did not label it. It did not monetize it or turn it into content fast enough to outrun it. It simply stood there, streets, buildings, hearts held together by a sound that had no beginning, no end, and no visible origin. As if the city itself had been tuned. And someone, somewhere beyond sight, had gently begun to play. The first miracles didn't announce themselves. There were no flashes of light, no public declarations, no moments designed for crowds. They happened quietly, almost cautiously, as if avoiding attention on purpose. A man standing near the edge of the crowd pressed his fingers into his palm and froze. The ache he'd carried for years, an old injury from a warehouse accident, was gone. Not eased, not dulled, gone. He flexed his hand once, then again, heart pounding harder than his body ever had at physical therapy. He didn't tell anyone. He slipped his hand into his pocket and breathed through it. On a nearby bench, a woman who had lived with a constant ringing in her ears tilted her head. Confused by the sudden absence of sound she had learned to live with. The city noise returned, sharp and clear, but the ringing did not. She touched her ear, then her throat, afraid that naming it might undo it. She said nothing. A teenage girl scrolling her phone felt her chest loosen without warning. For months, panic had tightened around her like a vice, unpredictable, embarrassing, exhausting. Now, standing still beneath the open sky, she realized she could breathe all the way in, all the way out. She didn't cry. She just stood there, stunned by the simplicity of it. No one collapsed dramatically. No one shouted, "Miracle." That was the pattern. A grandfather straightened without his cane and then instinctively reached for it again. Unsure which version of his body to trust. A woman silently forgave someone she had sworn she never would and felt the weight lift before she understood what had happened. A man who hadn't slept through the night in years leaned against a railing and closed his eyes. Not in exhaustion, but in peace. What made it stranger was how restrained it all was. People sensed something had changed. But there was no urge to prove it. No rush to film. No desire to persuade others. Each moment felt personal. Almost confidential, like something given, not displayed. A nurse who noticed the changes around her later struggled to describe it. It wasn't like symptoms disappearing, she said. It was like, the problem was never supposed to be there in the first place. Some realized it immediately. Others wouldn't notice until hours later, walking without pain, sleeping without fear, remembering a grief that no longer cut the same way. And many would never be sure at all. They would tell themselves it was adrenaline, coincidence, timing, anything that preserved control over the narrative. Yet among those who felt it, there was a shared instinct: don't cheapen this by turning it into spectacle. Whatever was happening did not seek witnesses. It did not ask for validation. It did not demand belief. It moved gently, person by person, healing not what would make headlines but what would allow someone to stand up. Breathe deeply, forgive quietly, or go home lighter than they arrived. In a nation addicted to proof and performance, the most unsettling part was this. The miracles behaved as if being seen was optional. As if the point was never to impress the crowd, only to restore the individual. By late afternoon, the machinery of explanation finally arrived. News vans edged into positions they had never rehearsed for. Producers shouted into headsets, trying to decide whether this was a local anomaly or a national event. Chirons appeared, disappeared, then reappeared with safer language. Unusual atmospheric phenomenon, followed minutes later by report still unconfirmed. Cameras pointed upward. Nothing happened on cue. A meteorologist stood before a green screen, cycling through satellite images and Doppler data. There's no storm system, she said carefully, choosing each word like a stepping stone. No temperature inversion, no known optical illusion that would, she stopped, aware the sentence had nowhere left to go. At a nearby university lab, physicists replayed footage frame by frame. They adjusted contrast, ran simulations, checked timestamps. One shook his head. If this is a projection, there's no projector, he said. If it's light, it's behaving like mass. And if it's mass, he didn't finish the thought. The media wanted experts. The experts wanted variables. There were none to isolate. Social platforms filled with slowed down clips, side-by-side comparisons, debunking threads that debunked each other. AI models were fed the footage and spat back probabilities without confidence. Inconclusive, insufficient data, no matching precedent. That phrase appeared again and again. In a control room downtown, an editor watched the feed and frowned. Why aren't people arguing? She asked. Ratings thrived on conflict, belief versus skepticism, right versus wrong, but the crowd footage showed neither. Just faces tilted upward, silent, performative, no chance, no interviews demanding answers. A veteran reporter tried to provoke a reaction on air. What do you think this really is? He asked a man in the crowd. The man blinked, considered, then replied honestly, I don't know, and I'm okay with that. The clip never aired. Scientists issued statements that were technically correct and emotionally empty. Journalists repeated them with increasing discomfort. The usual rhythm claim, counterclaim, controversy refused to start. What unsettled the system most wasn't that answers were missing. It was that they weren't being demanded. The public, so often divided into camps, seemed unified in restraint. People watched the coverage, then turned it off. They trusted their own eyes more than expert commentary and yet didn't weaponize that trust against anyone else. A communications professor noted it quietly. This isn't anti-science, she said. It's post-explanation. For the first time in a long time, American science and American media found themselves facing the same limit, not of intelligence or technology, but of jurisdiction. Whatever had unfolded that day did not reject analysis. It simply did not belong to it. And as headlines stalled and narratives failed to stabilize, a rare admission surfaced across institutions that rarely agree on anything. Something had happened. They just didn't own the language for it. When she was gone, there was no aftermath, only absence. No fading light, no dramatic withdrawal. One moment, the presence that had drawn a nation into stillness was there. The next, the sky was simply sky again. Blue, empty, ordinary. People waited for something else to happen. Some closing sign that would tell them the moment was officially over. Nothing came. Slowly, movement returned. Cars rolled forward. Phones buzzed again. Someone cleared their throat. America restarted, but not at full speed. And not in quite the same way. What remained was harder to measure. A man who had stood silently for hours called his estranged sister for the first time in years. Unsure why the urge felt urgent now. A woman who had never prayed before lit a candle that night. Not because she suddenly believed everything, but because silence no longer felt empty. Children asked fewer questions than expected. Adults asked more. In churches, attendance didn't spike dramatically. That surprised people. There were no mass conversions. No overnight revival statistics to report. Instead, something quieter happened. People lingered. They stayed after services. They listened longer. They argued less about certainty and more about meaning. In places far from New York, people who hadn't seen anything directly still felt changed. Not convinced, changed. As if the story had reached them without needing proof. As if something had reminded them of a dimension of life they'd forgotten how to name. Skeptics remained skeptics. Believers remained believers. But the tone softened on both sides. Mockery felt out of place. So did triumph. What lingered most was not the image but the permission. Permission to stop. Permission to not explain everything. Permission to admit that mystery does not threaten truth. No institution claimed ownership of what happened. No movement successfully branded it. The event resisted packaging, monetization, and slogans. It survived only in memory, conversation, and quiet personal recalibration. Some would spend years trying to recreate the moment through footage, analysis, debate. Others would never speak of it again, but live slightly differently because of it. And that may have been the point. Not to leave behind evidence that forces belief, but an experience that invites reflection. Not an argument to win but a light that briefly passed through. Showing what still mattered when the noise fell away. If stories like this move something in you, if you sense that light still flickering in the darkness, then stay close. Subscribe to Mary's Light in the Darkness, and keep walking with us through the moments that don't shout, but change everything.